Hey, welcome back to the channel. So today we're working on the Blackhawk that's going down to Arkansas, and we've got the body finished and all the feathering's done, all the heat treatment's done, and now we're going to work on the head and finish the head. And to do that, we're starting with the beak. And what I've started here is each side of the beak. So I'm using the bag here and a hammer and the side of the table and just whatever I can to start putting some initial shape into the beak. So it'll change as I go, and as I tack, I'll squeeze it together, and all the tacks will help shape it. I used a yellow piece of paper as a template, and I took 2 pieces of yellow paper, I taped them together, and then I used that, kind of spread it out just to see if that's the shape that I'm going to go with. And I use that as a template to create these pieces. So now that I have these pieces, I can weld them together, and I'm hoping that I put enough initial shape into these that I can bend them and play with them and get that look that I'm looking for the top of the beak. Now, once I get this done and I get the upper beak welded, I'll probably measure and fit the lower part of the beak, the lower jaw, and shape that and fit it into the upper piece. And then once the beak is completed, the rest of the head will be made out of steel. So that's what we're going to work our way towards over the next few hours, maybe even into tomorrow it might take me. So that's kind of the size that you're going to be looking at. So the beak curves down, his eyes will be over here and in his mouth, and his head's a little bigger on this one. I wanted to make the body look a little fatter for this piece, so that's the direction that I'm heading to. So as you can see, that I'm working with fully mirror polished stainless steel. So I want to try to keep this finish as good as possible when I'm working with it. And then, so when I weld this up, now when I weld these 2 pieces together, I'm going to let them follow each other so it's not too warped. I'm just going to let them squeeze together with the tacks and try to keep this seam as straight as possible. That's the key to making a nice beak, because once the seam is straight, and as you can see, they flare out. So I have to work these together till they're nice and straight, and then I can start bending it. But I have to be careful when I'm bending it that it doesn't pull the nose one way or another, because the front of the beak's going to look crooked then. So it'll ruin. I've done it before. I've got a few beaks on the shelf that just didn't end up nice and straight, and they don't look right. So before we tack this up, I'm just going to clamp the back side of it here. And it can be a little finicky when you've only got 2 hands. But I want to clamp it so it's really quite tight, and it'll allow me to really kind of pull on the metal as I'm closing it up and welding it. So we're working with 304 stainless, and we're using a 308 filler rod. It's a very compatible rod for 304, and so we're using a fine rod today. This is only 18 gauge stainless, and we're using a 1/16 filler rod. One of the tricks that I like to do, and I haven't done that yet, and I just stopped myself before I pulled the trigger, is I like to purge the system. So what this allows me to do is make sure that I've turned my bottle on. I can look at the ball in the regulator and see what setting I have, and I can hear the gas coming out. So a lot of times if you just grab your machine, turn it on, turn the bottle on, go to do a weld, that gas hasn't worked its way through the line up to the end of your torch. And so what will happen is that first shot of electricity is going to contaminate your weld, and you're already starting off with a bad start. And believe me, I do it more often than not, and I'm training myself to always purge that gas before you're doing your first tack. Another thing to watch out for is when you peel that protective coating. It's called a laser coating. It's a PVC coating, a plastic coating on the stainless to protect the finish that it comes in. When you peel it, sometimes little residue, little pieces of plastic will still be on, especially near cut edges and weld seams. So you want to make sure that you inspect your material really carefully and rub that the glue and the excess plastic that's near the edges is very, I don't know why, but it always stays there. And you want to make sure that you rub it off. Make sure all the glue and all the contaminants that are near your weld edge are there. You don't need to grind or prep your weld edge with thin stainless, but you should have a nice clean, tight fit and make sure that there's no glue and residue around your weld. I don't know if you can see that in the camera or not, but I certainly have a little bit of glue just on the end here. And what happens if you leave that black residue on your material, as you get down close to it to weld, it'll start to smoke, it'll smell, it will kind of melt on the surface and can contaminate your weld, and it can also burn into the surface, and the only way to remove it is by polishing it out, and that's kind of a pain in the ass. So, and we have the first tack. So what that first tack does, that locks in my two pieces now, does the job of my clamp. I can actually let my clamp go. In this case, I'm just going to leave it there because I'll be squeezing these two together. But it just gives you some extra security now. It's locked in. I tried to line these up both at the back here. So when I work my way forward to the front, I'm hoping these were mirror images of each other. And now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to manipulate this by hand. And it's really, really tough because I have a lot of shape into it. And I want to probably might even have to use a pair of my Bessie clamps to start pulling it together. Generally, I can pull it together enough and line it up enough that I can tack it. And so I'm going to just fuse tack it with no filler rod and just try to use that as far as I go. It's really important that you line the two surfaces up and that one surface isn't higher than the other. You don't want one side being wavy or mismatched. So the intention is to grind this weld off after it's all welded and then blend it in and polish it so it's the top of the beak. I'm going to try to keep this profile as round as possible. After the weld is in there, that might even mean hammering and dollying that weld, compressing that weld, and trying to the best I can to keep this seam straight. And this is going to be a fight. This is never easy to try to pull these together and keep that nice straight seam. But I'll do my best. If it's not perfect, then you can always cut it apart and try to do it. But with stainless, it's always more work and more of a headache when you have to start cutting things apart. So I try to take my time and get this right the first time. We've got the initial tacks done, and you can see I've tried to keep it straight as possible. Now these are folded in, and this is what I was talking about. So I had a little bit of a gap where I tried tacking right there and it didn't want to fuse without filler rod. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to carefully squeeze near that edge that'll blend out. If I make any marks or damage to that surface when I'm clamping it, it'll be so close to that weld area that I'll be grinding it out anyway and you won't see where I clamped it. But there is just a slight little 1/16 of a gap, or maybe not even that. So I'm going to clamp that, tack that, and then we've got tacks between 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch, and 1/2 inch all the way down. So now that seam's tight, I'll just put a little tack on, lock it in. Now I can remove this clamp, and now I'm going to go back and I'm going to tack about every 1/4 inch in between each one of these. There, that's it. So we've got an initial start. The beak looks pretty nice and straight. It's fully tacked now. So now I can figure out the spread. So the key now is to start shaping the sides of the beak to the width of the mouth that I want to use. And to do that, rather than just grab it and start bending, I'll go to my phone, I'll Google up a hawk head or a falcon head or an eagle head, depending on what I'm making. And I will do more shaping in here. I don't know if you can see that, but for me, this side is a little more flared out than this side. So I'll use a tool to put pressure in this area and flare it like that, but we'll do that in the final shaping. For now, I'm gonna do a little homework and make sure that I am looking at the beak that I want to be making, and then we'll come back and we'll do the final shaping. And then that final shaping will just really just be pulling it and shaping it a little bit, maybe bending these a certain way. Then it's going to get tossed off to the side. I'm not going to weld it yet, and I'll actually start fabricating the lower beak. Once the lower beak has its shape and all the components that I need to make the lower beak, I'll finish making the lower beak. I'll attach it and tack it here, get the distance and get it all tacked up so the whole beak is complete. And then when I'm happy with everything, I'll do the final weld, and then I'll do the grinding, the cleaning, and the polishing, and we'll have a finished product. So next step now is to do a little bit of homework, make sure we're bending the beak the way it needs to look to be a Blackhawk, and we'll start on the lower jaw. On this beak, I don't like how it's too vertical. It needs to come back more to give length to the head, and the angle is going to be kind of looking down. This is going to get trimmed off, and I'm going to reshape the back. So that'll be the next step that I do. But I don't like how these are flared down and you know, flared so wide. And then when I mount it, it's going to come up and kind of be looking down at the ground. So where I want the head, I want the head staring at the ground and these coming straight down. So that'll be the next step.